At 2:40 p.m. on the 6th of July, 1944, the Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey Circus began its afternoon performance in Hartford, Connecticut. The Big Top was pitched on a grassy lot at the corner of Barber Street and Pembroke Avenue, part of the city's North End. The crowd was estimated at 6,700 people, mostly women and children, many seated on wooden bleachers that rose in steep tiers around the central ring. The show had been running for about 15 minutes when a small flame appeared near the top of the tent, close to an exit chute used by performers and animals. A usher spotted it, maybe 200 feet up along the canvas wall, a lick of orange at the edge of the waterproofing wax. He did not call a fire alarm. He did not alert the audience. He walked calmly toward the ringmaster and whispered something instead. At 2:43 p.m., the band was still playing. The aerialists were still suspended on their trapeze rigging. The first column of flame, driven by the paraffin and gasoline mixture that had been painted onto the canvas to make it waterproof, traveled across the tent ceiling in seconds. The Big Top measured 570 feet by 300 feet, the largest tent in the world at the time, supported by 6 wooden center poles and a network of guy ropes. When the fire reached the paraffin coating, the entire roof became an accelerant. Witnesses later described the sound as a sudden, wet roar, like a giant sheet being ripped apart. At 2:44 p.m., the crowd realized something was wrong. People began to stand to turn to push toward the exits. But many of the exit flaps, designed to be opened from inside by pulling a rope, had been tied shut from the outside to prevent people from sneaking in without tickets. Others were blocked by animal chutes and parked trucks. At 2:45 p.m., the center pole of the Big Top, the main mast that held up the highest point of the canvas, burned through at its base and fell. The tent folded in on itself, collapsing onto the bleachers and the crowd below. The fabric, still burning, dropped like a blanket over hundreds of people. Those who tried to crawl out found themselves tangled in rope, canvas, and collapsed seating. The heat melted the bleachers' wooden planks. The gasoline-based flames reached temperatures high enough to ignite clothing from a distance. By 2:47 p.m., the entire structure was a single, contained inferno. The first fire engines arrived at 2:48 p.m., but they had trouble getting close because of the parked cars, the carnival wagons, and the chaos of screaming, running, and burning people. Many who escaped ran for blocks, their clothes still on fire. Inside the tent, the sound shifted from screaming to something worse, a wet mechanical hiss that witnesses later struggled to describe. When the fire was finally extinguished, around 3:30 in the afternoon, the scene inside the tent was almost beyond comprehension. 167 people died. More than 700 were injured. Of the dead, 116 were children. Many of the bodies were burned beyond recognition. The cause of the fire was never conclusively determined. The circus was never charged with arson. No one ever went to prison. But what investigators uncovered in the weeks and months that followed was not a single failure or a single moment of negligence. It was a chain of decisions, design choices, business pressures, and local oversight gaps that turned a family afternoon under a canvas roof into a mass casualty event in under 4 minutes. What happened? The circus that arrived in Hartford was the largest traveling show in America. Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey operated on a scale that required hundreds of workers, dozens of animal cages, miles of electrical cable, and a tent that covered nearly 2 acres. Because of wartime restrictions on materials like rubber and metal, many of the tent's safety features had been bypassed or improvised. The canvas was treated with a mixture of paraffin wax and gasoline, applied by hand to repel rain. The mixture was highly flammable, but that was known and accepted because it had not burned before. The tent was also equipped with a fire extinguisher system made of carbon tetrachloride bottles mounted on the poles. Those bottles were breakable, but many were empty or had been removed in prior years to reduce weight. The exits were designed as simple cutouts in the canvas, each with a rope that, when pulled, would unfasten the closure and allow the flap to swing outward. but circus management had been losing money due to low attendance and wartime travel restrictions, so ticket revenue was a constant concern. To prevent gate crashers, the exit ropes were tied off on the outside of the tent. That meant a person inside could not open the flap. The only way out was to push through the canvas, and the canvas was soaked in gasoline. The fire started at the top of the tent, near the back exit chute where the animals and performers came and went. The most likely cause, according to the official investigation, was a cigarette or a match dropped by a spectator or a worker, possibly near a pile of hay or a canvas fold. But there was no definitive proof. Some witnesses said they saw a small flame appear as if from nowhere, traveling along a crack in the canvas. Others claimed a boy had been smoking and accidentally lit the tent. Another theory involved an abandoned hot glue pot used by the seamstresses who repaired the tent during setup. The fire spread so quickly that even if the cause had been known at the moment of ignition, there would have been no time to stop it. The failure, then, was not in the first spark. It was in the conditions that allowed the spark to become a catastrophe within 60 seconds. The waterproofing chemical, the tied exits, the collapse of the center pole, the lack of fire drills or evacuation plans for the audience, the assumption that a circus tent was just a tent, not a structure that could kill, and the circus itself had been warned. In 1943, the city of Hartford had inspected the big top and found it to be a fire hazard. Circus was required to provide additional fire extinguishers and to keep the exits clear. Those requirements were not enforced. The circus did not comply fully. No one followed up. When investigators dug into the background of the circus company, they found a pattern of corner cutting. The Ringling family had been struggling financially after years of Depression-era losses. The show's equipment was aging. The tent ropes were frayed. The canvas had been patched and repatched. The animal cages were old. The performers were overworked. The entire operation was held together by habit and momentum, not by safety protocols. The 1944 season had already seen several smaller fires in other tents, all contained, none reported to authorities. The Hartford fire was the first time the big top itself caught. The city's emergency response was also hampered. The Hartford Fire Department had not been notified of the circus's arrival. They did not have a pre-planned access route. The nearest fire hydrant was several hundred feet away. When the first engine arrived, its hoses were too short to reach the fire. The crew had to lay line after line, losing precious seconds. The fire spread so fast that by the time water hit the canvas, the structure was already collapsing. The police and ambulance services were overwhelmed. The hospitals received victims before they even knew there was a mass casualty event. Triage was improvised. Bodies were laid out on the lawn of a nearby school. Parents searched through rows of blankets looking for their children. The aftermath brought changes. The circus industry voluntarily moved away from gasoline-based waterproofing. Fireproof canvas became standard. Exit ropes were no longer tied shut. City ordinances across the country began requiring tents over a certain size to have sprinkler systems and clear, unblocked exits. But the question of why the circus was allowed to operate as it did, and why no one in authority stopped it before the fire, was never fully answered in court. The circus offered settlements to the families of the victims. Some accepted, others sued. The case was eventually settled out of court. No one was convicted. The show went on the next season, but it was never the same. Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey continued for another 70 years, but the Hartford fire remained a shadow over every big top that went up. How could this have happened? The tent was enormous. The crowd was mostly children. The exits were sealed. The waterproofing was flammable, and these facts were not hidden. They were visible to anyone who looked. The ushers knew the exits were tied. The ringmaster knew the tent had been painted with gasoline. The city inspectors had seen it. The circus management saw the fire extinguisher bottles sitting empty. And yet every person in that chain, from the ticket taker to the president of the company, assumed that nothing would go wrong because nothing had gone wrong before. That is the kind of failure that does not show up in an annual report or a safety audit. It lives in the gap between what people know and what they are willing to act on. When investigators later interviewed the survivors, many described the same strange detail: the silence that came after the fire. Not the silence of death, but the silence of a crowd that had no time to scream. The fire moved so fast that many people simply did not react. They were still sitting, still watching the aerialists, when the canvas above them ignited and fell. Their last thoughts were not of escape. They were of a show that was still going until it was not. The Hartford Circus Fire is not remembered as the deadliest fire in American history. That title belongs to others. But it is remembered as one of the most preventable, because the disaster did not come out of the sky or rise up from the ground. It was built into the tent. It was painted onto the fabric. It was tied into the ropes, and it waited. 4:24 in the afternoon. July 6, 1944, Hartford, Connecticut. A crowd of nearly 7,000 people had gathered under the big top of the Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey Circus. The show was in its second performance of the day. The matinee had drawn families, children on summer vacation, mothers with infants, and a handful of servicemen home on leave. Inside the tent, the temperature was climbing. It was a humid Thursday, and the canvas, treated with a mixture of paraffin and gasoline to repel water, had been baking in the sun since early morning. The heat had not yet dried out the grass beneath the bleachers, but it had softened the wax coating on the fabric. Everything was in place for a routine afternoon of entertainment. Only a few minutes later, something was off. At 4:25, the aerialists were performing. The band was playing. The crowd was watching the flying Wallendas start their death-defying act. Then a few people near the rear of the tent noticed a small flame. It appeared near the base of a sidewall, close to the back exit chute, where the elephants and performers entered and exited the ring. Some witnesses said it looked like a match being struck. Others described a quick flicker traveling along a crack in the canvas. Within seconds, the fire climbed upward. It caught the gasoline-soaked fabric and shot across the ceiling in a wave. The entire top of the tent erupted in flames before most of the audience had even turned their heads. What happened next was not panic. It was confusion. The crowd did not scream at first. They watched. Some thought it was part of the act, a special effect, a stunt. The ringmaster shouted for everyone to remain seated, but that was impossible. The fire was already consuming the canvas above their heads. Pieces of burning fabric began to fall. The center pole, which held up the entire structure, was supported by ropes that passed through the roof. When those ropes burned through, the pole dropped straight down into the crowd. The tent collapsed in sections. People in the upper bleachers were thrown forward. Those near the exits tried to push through the canvas, but the flaps were tied shut from the outside. The ropes had been fastened to keep gate crashers out. Now they kept victims in. The fire had been burning for approximately 60 seconds when the first 911 call came in. The Hartford Fire Department responded within minutes, but the nearest hydrant was more than 600 feet away. The first engine had hoses that were only 300 feet long. Firefighters had to connect multiple lengths of hose, and by the time water reached the tent, the canvas was already gone. The metal poles stood like charred ribs. The bleachers were burning. The grass was on fire. Bodies lay scattered across the field. The official count would be 168 dead and more than 700 injured. Most of the dead were children. Many were under the age of 10. Entire families were wiped out. The medical examiners worked through the night, using dental records and personal effects to identify the remains. Several bodies were never identified. They were buried in a mass grave at the state cemetery. The city of Hartford held a day of mourning. Flags flew at half-staff. The governor ordered an investigation. But who was responsible? The Circus Corporation, Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey, was based in Chicago and operated under federal interstate commerce regulations. The city of Hartford had inspection authority, but the circus had been inspected only once in the previous year, and the inspector had not found the exits tied shut. The waterproofing mixture, a standard circus industry practice at the time, had been applied by workers who were paid by the circus. not by an independent safety contractor. The fire extinguisher system consisted of glass bottles filled with carbon tetrachloride, mounted on poles. Many of those bottles were found empty after the fire. Others had been removed during the war to repurpose the metal. The replacements were never ordered. What investigators found, when they sifted through the wreckage and interviewed survivors, was a network of failures. The circus had been warned. In 1943, a Hartford fire inspector had cited the Big Top for inadequate fire extinguishers and blocked exits. The circus promised to correct the violations. No follow-up inspection was ever conducted. The circus also knew that its canvas was flammable. In fact, many circus crews would test the flammability of a new canvas by lighting a small piece. They knew it burned. But they also knew that paraffin wax alone would not repel rain well enough. Adding gasoline made the coating more effective. They accepted the risk because they had never seen a tent burn with people inside. The circus's financial situation added pressure. The company was losing money. The wartime economy had reduced attendance. Many performers had been drafted. Animal feed was rationed. Gasoline was rationed. Traveling was expensive. The circus cut corners wherever possible. The tent that burned in Hartford had been in service for several years. It had been repaired multiple times. The seams were weak. The ropes were frayed. The pole that fell had a known defect, a wooden joint that had been weakened by previous movement. The circus had not replaced it. When the investigation turned to the cause of the fire, no single origin could be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. The most widely accepted theory was that a spectator had dropped a cigarette or a match into a pile of hay or canvas near the wall. Another theory pointed to a small flame from a glue pot, used by seamstresses who had been repairing the tent during setup. A third theory suggested that a boy named Robert Seggi, a teenage worker with a history of setting fires, had started the blaze. Seggi later confessed to setting several smaller fires in Ohio, but he recanted the confession regarding Hartford. No charges were ever filed against him. The official report listed the cause as undetermined. But cause was not the central question. The central question was why the tent became a death trap. The exits were tied. The waterproofing was flammable. The fire extinguishers were empty. The fire department had no prearranged plan. The ushers had no evacuation training. The crowd had no instructions. The ringmaster told people to stay in their seats. That instruction killed people. If the audience had been told to leave immediately, many might have survived. Instead, they waited. The legal aftermath was chaotic. The circus offered settlements to the families of the victims almost immediately. The offers were low, around $1,000 per death, but many families accepted because they were poor and needed the money to bury their children. Lawsuits were filed by those who refused. The cases were consolidated into a class action suit. The circus argued that the fire was an accident, that it had done everything reasonably expected of a traveling show, and that the city of Hartford was also at fault for failing to enforce fire codes. The trial lasted several years. In the end, the circus settled for a total of just under $5 million. No one was convicted of any crime. The circus never admitted wrongdoing. The changes that followed were slow. The National Fire Protection Association updated its standards for tent materials. The circus industry voluntarily agreed to use flame-retardant canvas. Cities began requiring sprinkler systems in large tents. Some states passed laws requiring that tent exits be clearly marked and unlocked during performances. But the practices that had created the conditions for the fire were so deeply embedded in the circus's business model that many continued for years. Smaller circuses still used gasoline-soaked canvas into the 1950s. The Big Top of Ringling Brothers was not fully fireproofed until after another smaller fire in 1947. The human cost was not measured in dollars or policy changes. It was measured in the lives of the 168 who died and the hundreds who lived with burns, scars, and memories. Many survivors never entered a tent again. Some could not tolerate the smell of canvas. Others had nightmares for decades. The children who lost parents or siblings grew up in orphanages or with relatives. The parents who lost children often divorced. The guilt of having taken their families to the circus that day consumed some. The city of Hartford, which had prided itself on its safety record, faced a crisis of confidence. How could a civic institution like the circus be allowed to operate with so little oversight? The question echoed through municipal governments across the country. The circus fire also changed the way Americans thought about public safety. Before 1944, a circus tent was seen as a temporary structure, not subject to the same building codes as a theater or a factory. After the fire, that assumption was challenged. The tent had killed more people than most factory fires. It had killed in broad daylight, in front of thousands of witnesses, during a family event. The idea that a disaster could happen anywhere, at any time, even at a place meant for joy, entered the public consciousness. Investigators later reconstructed the final moments of the fire using witness accounts and engineering analysis. The fire had burned approximately 4 minutes from first spark to collapse. In that time, the heat had reached temperatures high enough to melt aluminum. The canvas had turned into a curtain of flame that dropped onto the crowd. The center pole fell after the supporting ropes burned. The bleachers, made of wood and metal, ignited when burning canvas fell onto them. The crowd surged toward the side exits, but most found the canvas unyielding. Those who pushed through the fabric were often cut by the ropes or burned by the flaming material. Many died in the pileup near the exits. Some died beneath the collapsed bleachers. The response of the Hartford Fire Department, though delayed by the distance to the hydrant, was ultimately efficient. They extinguished the main fire within 40 minutes, but the damage was done. The medical response was improvised. Hospitals sent ambulances to the scene, but there were not enough. Volunteers drove private cars to transport the injured. The city morgue was overwhelmed. Temporary morgues were set up in a school gymnasium and a nearby armory. Parents walked through rows of bodies looking for their children. Some never found them. What remains unanswered is the question of accountability. The circus never faced criminal charges. The city never faced a lawsuit for its inspection failures. The individual managers who made the decision to tie the exits and to use gasoline-soaked canvas were never named in court. The investigation concluded with a report that blamed multiple contributing factors, but did not assign criminal negligence. The circus closed its 1944 season early and resumed the next year with a new tent made of flame-retardant material. The show went on, but the memory did not fade. In the decades since, the Hartford Circus Fire has become a case study in disaster prevention. It is taught in fire science programs and safety engineering courses. It is cited as an example of how routine assumptions, that a tent is safe because it has always been safe, can lead to catastrophic outcomes. The fire also raised questions about the ethics of profit over safety. The circus was a business. It made decisions based on cost and revenue. Those decisions killed people. The question is not whether the circus intended harm. It is why the system in place did not prevent harm. Today, the site of the fire is a residential neighborhood. A small memorial stands at the corner of Hamilton Street and Barber Street, near where the tent once stood. The names of the 168 victims are carved into stone. Every year on July 6th, a ceremony is held. Survivors, now in their 80s and 90s, attend. They remember the heat, the noise, the silence. They remember the people who did not come home. The Hartford Circus Fire is not forgotten. It cannot be forgotten because the same conditions that caused it, complacency, corner cutting, broken oversight, and the belief that it cannot happen here, still exist. They exist in every crowded place where safety is measured only by past performance. They exist in every decision to tie an exit rope for convenience. They exist in every empty fire extinguisher that nobody checks. On the morning of July 7, 1944, investigators entered the smoldering remains of the Big Top. The tent had collapsed hours earlier. The canvas was now a blackened crust. The bleachers were twisted metal and charcoal. The ground was littered with shoes, purses, eyeglasses, and melted nylon stockings. The air still smelled of gasoline and burned flesh. The medical examiner's team began the grim task of identifying the dead. They worked from photographs, dental records, and personal items. Many of the bodies were so badly burned that identification took weeks. Some victims were never identified. They were buried in a mass grave at the Hartford City Cemetery. At 10 o'clock that morning, Hartford Fire Chief John Reardon stood at the scene. He gave a brief statement to reporters. He said the fire had started near the menagerie entrance, but he could not say how. He confirmed that the fire extinguishers on site had been empty. He said the tent's exits had been tied shut. He did not elaborate. He then left to meet with city officials. The meeting lasted 2 hours. The mayor ordered an immediate investigation. By noon, a temporary morgue had been set up in the gymnasium of Hartford Public High School. Rows of white sheets covered the bodies. Parents and relatives walked slowly between them. They lifted corners. They looked at faces. They cried or they did not. Some fainted. The Red Cross set up a station for grief counseling. The city asked anyone who had lost a child to report to the school. By the end of the day, 112 families had filed missing person reports. That evening, the Hartford Police Department began taking statements. Witnesses described the chaos. A woman said she had been sitting in the 4th row with her daughter. She saw a small flame near the menagerie entrance. She thought it was part of the show. Then the flame climbed the side of the tent. It spread in seconds. The canvas was burning overhead. She grabbed her daughter and ran. She pushed through a side opening. The rope had not been tied there. She survived. Her daughter did not. She said she lost her in the crowd. Another witness, a man named Walter Allen, said he had been an usher. He had been told by the ringmaster not to let anyone leave. He obeyed. When the fire started, he tried to untie one of the exit ropes. The knot was tight. He could not loosen it. He watched people pile up against the canvas. He tried to cut the rope with a pocket knife. By then, the canvas was on fire. He fled through a tear in the fabric. He suffered second-degree burns on his arms. He later told investigators that the ringmaster's instruction to stay seated was the worst thing he had ever heard. By July 8th, investigators had recovered the charred remains of the tent's center pole. It was a wooden pole about 70 feet tall. It had burned at the base. The collapse had occurred about 4 minutes after the fire started. That timeline was confirmed by a photographer's stopwatch. A newsreel camera had been filming the show when the fire began. The film survived. It showed the flames appearing at 2:42. It showed the crowd rising. It showed the ringmaster waving his arms. It showed the tent falling at 2:46. The film was used to determine crowd behavior. People in the center rows stayed seated for nearly a minute. Those near the sides began moving immediately. The bottleneck at the main entrance was visible. The tied exits were not. But the film showed a group of about 30 people trying to push through the canvas near the rear. They were unsuccessful. How could the circus have allowed this to happen? That question dominated the inquest that began on July 10th. The coroner's jury heard testimony from circus employees, city inspectors, fire officials, and survivors. The circus's general manager, James Haley, testified that the tent had been inspected by the Hartford Fire Prevention Bureau 2 days before the fire. He said the inspector had found no violations. The inspector, a man named John O'Neill, testified that he had not checked the fire extinguishers. He said he had assumed they were functional. He had not looked at the exits. He said he had seen the ropes but had not thought they were tied. He had walked through the tent for about 10 minutes. He had signed a certificate of occupancy. The certificate was admissible. The jury asked O'Neill why he had not checked the extinguishers. He said it was not standard procedure. He said the circus had been in business for decades. He trusted them. The jury asked Haley why the exits were tied. Haley said it was to prevent people from entering without paying. He said it was common practice in the circus industry. He said the exits were not intended to be permanent closures. They were meant to be untied in an emergency. He admitted that no emergency drills had been conducted. He admitted that the ushers had not been trained. He admitted that the ringmaster's instruction to stay seated was standard procedure to prevent panic. At that point, the jury stopped asking questions. The inquest lasted 2 weeks. 120 witnesses were called. The evidence was summarized in a report released on July 24th. The official cause of the fire remained undetermined, but the report listed multiple contributing factors: the use of gasoline-soaked paraffin to waterproof the canvas, the tied exits, the empty fire extinguishers, the lack of fire drills, the absence of a sprinkler system, the failure of the city to enforce fire codes. The report did not recommend criminal charges. It said the disaster was a result of negligence on multiple levels, but it did not name individuals. The public reaction was outrage. The Hartford Courant ran an editorial titled, "Who is to Blame?" It said the circus had murdered 168 people. It said the city had been an accomplice. It demanded a grand jury investigation. The grand jury was convened in August. It heard the same testimony. It reached the same conclusion. No indictments were filed. The legal battle shifted to civil court. By September 1944, more than 300 lawsuits had been filed against the circus. The plaintiffs sought damages for wrongful death, personal injury, and property loss. The circus responded by offering settlements. The first offer was $1,000 per death. Many families accepted. They had no money for funerals. The circus then raised the offer to $2,000 for families who had children killed. Some accepted. Others held out. The class action suit was consolidated in 1945. The trial began in 1946. The circus's defense argued that the fire was an act of God. They argued that the rope ties were common industry practice. They argued that the city was negligent for not inspecting properly. They argued that the audience panicked and caused the pileup. They pointed to the unidentified boy who might have started the fire. They said the circus had no way to predict such an event. The plaintiffs presented expert testimony. Fire engineers explained that the tent materials were highly flammable. Safety experts testified that tied exits violated basic fire codes. A former circus employee said the practice of tying exits had been standard for years. He said it was known to be dangerous. He said managers were told to untie them in emergencies. They did not. In 1947, the jury reached a verdict. It found the circus negligent. It awarded damages to the plaintiffs. The total amount was just under $5 million, about $70 million in today's currency. But the circus did not pay that amount. It settled out of court for a lump sum. The exact figure was sealed. Most estimates put it around $2 million. The circus admitted no wrongdoing. It continued touring. What about the individual workers who tied the exits? They were never identified. The ushers, the seamstresses, the rigging crew, none were named in court. The ringmaster who told the crowd to stay seated was never sued. The fire inspector who certified the tent was transferred to a desk job. He retired 2 years later. The fire also changed the circus industry, but only slowly. The Ringling Brothers Circus, the largest in the country, ordered new tents made of flame-retardant canvas. The material was treated with a chemical called ammonium sulfate. It was not perfect, but it reduced the risk. Smaller circuses could not afford the new tents. They continued using old canvas soaked in paraffin and gasoline. Some did not switch until after another fire in 1949 killed 32 people at a circus in Cleveland. That fire was caused by a discarded cigarette near a pile of hay. The tent was not flame-proofed. The Hartford fire prompted the National Fire Protection Association to revise its standards. In 1945, it published a new code for tent materials. It required that all tent fabrics be treated with flame retardants. It required that tent exits be clearly marked and unlocked. It required that fire extinguishers be inspected monthly. It recommended sprinkler systems, but the code was not mandatory. It was a recommendation. Enforcement was left to local governments. Many cities adopted the code, others did not. In 1950, A survey by the National Safety Council found that only 40% of American cities had any fire code specific to tents. The rest relied on general building codes. The loophole remained. The human cost of the Hartford fire was not just in numbers. It was in the lives that were shattered. One survivor, a woman named Helen Davis, was 8 years old at the time. She attended the circus with her mother and 2 sisters. She remembered the heat and the screaming. She remembered her mother pushing her out through a tear in the canvas. She remembered looking back and seeing her mother fall. Her mother died. Her sisters died. She was burned on her arms and face. She was hospitalized for 3 months. She grew up in an orphanage. She never married. She said the fire took everything. Another survivor, a man named John Moran, was 12. He was there with his father. They had been sitting in the front row. When the fire started, his father told him to run. He ran to the main entrance. He looked back. His father was still in his seat, pointing toward the exit. He was directing people. He did not make it out. John Moran became a firefighter. He said he wanted to help prevent another fire like that. He served for 30 years. He never went to a circus. The psychological impact extended to the entire community. Hartford was a small city in 1944. Nearly everyone knew someone who had been at the circus. The trauma was collective. Schools closed for a week. Church services were held daily. Psychologists from Yale University volunteered to counsel survivors. They found that many children refused to sleep alone. Many parents could not speak about what they saw. The term survivor's guilt was not yet in common use, but the symptoms were present. In the decades after the fire, researchers studied the disaster as a case study in panic behavior. They analyzed the crowd dynamics. They found that people in the center rows waited longer to move because they could not see the fire. They found that the pileup at the exits was caused by a lack of clear direction. They found that people who had been given no instruction were more likely to survive than those who had been told to stay seated. The fire also influenced fire safety regulations for public assembly spaces. The requirement for exit signs, for panic bars on doors, for fire drills in schools and theaters, all were strengthened after 1944, but the lessons were not fully learned. The 1977 Beverly Hills Supper Club fire killed 165 people in a structure that had multiple fire code violations. The 2003 Station nightclub fire killed 100. Both fires involved blocked exits, flammable materials, and inadequate fire suppression. The pattern repeats. Today, the site of the Hartford Circus Fire is a quiet residential street. A small park called Hartford Circus Fire Memorial Park sits at the corner of Hamilton and Barber. The memorial names the 168 victims. It was dedicated in 2005, 61 years after the fire. The design includes a stone ring representing the circus ring and a plaque with the names. The park is maintained by the city. Every year on July 6th, a ceremony is held. The names are read aloud. A minute of silence is observed. The survivors, now in their late 80s and early 90s, attend if they can. Some are brought in wheelchairs. They listen to the names. They remember. The fire is also remembered in the collective memory of Hartford. The city has a museum exhibit at the Connecticut State Library. The exhibit includes a piece of melted nylon stocking, a burned ticket, a photograph of the tent. It asks the question, how could this happen? It offers no easy answer. What remains is the knowledge that systems designed to protect can fail. The Hartford Circus Fire was not a natural disaster. It was a failure of oversight, of common sense, of basic human decency. The exits were tied to stop people from sneaking in. The canvas was soaked in gasoline because it was cheap and effective. The fire extinguishers were empty because nobody checked. The tents were not required to have sprinklers because they were temporary. The people who died were children and mothers and fathers and grandparents. They came for a show. They got a fire. The circus continued without them. The tent continued to burn. The question continues to echo. At 4:30 p.m. on the afternoon of July 6, 1944, the last living survivor was pulled from the wreckage. The victim was a young girl, approximately 7 years old. She was found near the collapsed center pole. She had severe burns over 60% of her body. She was conscious but unable to speak. Paramedics rushed her to Hartford Hospital. She died 2 days later. She was never identified. Her name remains unknown. What happened in the hours and days after the fire was not simply rescue and recovery. It was a logistical emergency. The city had no disaster plan. Hartford was not prepared for mass casualties. The morgue at the city hospital could hold 12 bodies. The fire produced 168. The coroner, Dr. Abraham Goldenthal, declared the scene a public health crisis. He ordered refrigerated trucks brought in from local meatpacking plants. The trucks were parked behind the city morgue. Bodies were stacked in rows. Some were so badly burned that they could not be moved without disintegrating. Investigators worked in shifts. They wore surgical masks. The smell of burned flesh and melted canvas hung over the neighborhood for weeks. The identification process was slow and painful. Most victims had no identification on them. Children did not carry wallets. Parents had not expected to need to identify their children. Families gathered at the Hartford Armory where survivors had been taken. They waited for word. Lists were posted on bulletin boards. Names were read over the radio. The Red Cross set up a counseling station. Volunteers brought coffee and sandwiches. Nobody ate. By July 8th, only 47 victims had been identified. The rest were buried in a mass grave at Northwood Cemetery in Windsor, Connecticut. The grave was marked with a single stone, Unknown Victims of the Hartford Circus Fire, July 6, 1944. The stone was replaced in 1950 with individual markers for each victim, but most markers read unknown. Some families never found closure. They held funerals for empty caskets. The unidentified boy became a symbol of the fire. He was estimated to be between 6 and 8 years old. He had brown hair and blue eyes. He had been seated in the third row, section C, near the west exit. He was found with his arms wrapped around a girl of similar age. Investigators believed they were siblings. No one came forward to claim them. The boy's body was exhumed twice for DNA testing. The first attempt in 1991 failed. The second in 2004 succeeded. The DNA matched a woman from New York who had been searching for her brother for 60 years. His name was supposed to be kept private. The story was reported widely anyway. His name was Donald. He was 8 years old. How could a child disappear without anyone noticing? The answer lies in the chaos of the fire. Families were separated in the panic. Some parents assumed their children had run ahead. Others assumed they had been taken to a hospital. In the confusion, children were separated from parents and never reunited. One mother, a woman named Mary O'Connell, lost her 2 daughters in the fire. She searched for them for 3 days. She found them in the morgue. They had been listed as unknown. She identified them by their clothing. The fire also revealed a darker side of the circus industry. The Ringling Brothers Circus had been involved in a previous disaster. In 1918, a show train collision killed 60 people. In 1927, a circus tent collapsed in New York, killing 12. In 1939, a fire at a circus in Germany killed 20. The industry had a pattern. It moved from city to city, leaving behind a trail of tragedies. It paid settlements. It changed its name. It continued. After the Hartford fire, the circus industry faced a crisis of public trust. Attendance dropped. Parents refused to take children. The Ringling Brothers Circus filed for bankruptcy in 1945. It was reorganized. It continued under new ownership. It did not return to Hartford until 1955. The show was held indoors at the Hartford Civic Center. Nobody died. The fire also prompted changes in circus operations. New tents were made of flame-retardant material. Exits were required to be unlocked. Fire extinguishers were inspected before each show. A fire watch was assigned to patrol the perimeter. But the changes were not uniform. Smaller circuses continued to operate without oversight. They purchased used tents from larger circuses. The tents were often worn and treated with flammable chemicals. The inspections were superficial. The fire watch was a single employee holding a flashlight. In 1949, the Cleveland Circus Fire killed 32 people. The tent was not flame-proofed. The exits were blocked by equipment. The fire watch had fallen asleep. The circus was the Hagenbeck-Wallace Circus, a smaller outfit. It was shut down after the fire. Its owner was charged with manslaughter. He was acquitted. He said the fire was an accident. He said the audience panicked. He said the tent was treated with a flame retardant. The investigation found that the retardant was a mixture of borax and boric acid. It was not effective. It had not been properly applied. The 1950s saw a wave of new regulations. The National Fire Protection Association updated its tent code. The code was adopted by the International Fire Code. It became mandatory for all circuses operating in cities that adopted the code, but enforcement remained weak. In many cities, the fire inspector was a part-time employee. He did not have a car. He did not have a budget for testing materials. He relied on the circus's word. The federal government did not regulate circuses. The Interstate Commerce Commission regulated their trains. The Department of Agriculture regulated their animals. The Food and Drug Administration regulated their concessions, but the tent itself was not regulated. The fire code was left to the states. Some states had no code. Others adopted the NFPA code but did not enforce it. The result was a patchwork of safety standards. In 1956, the Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey Circus merged. The new company promised to make safety a priority. It installed sprinkler systems in its tents. It hired a full-time safety officer. It conducted fire drills with employees. It published a safety manual, but the manual was not distributed to smaller circuses. The information did not spread. The Hartford Circus Fire also influenced fire safety education. In 1945, the Hartford Fire Department began a public education program. Firefighters visited schools. They taught children how to stop, drop, and roll. They demonstrated fire drills. They showed films of the circus fire. The program was adopted by other cities. It became a model for Fire Prevention Week. But the program had a dark side. It relied on fear. Children were shown images of burned bodies. They were told that if they did not follow the rules, they would die. Some children developed phobias. They refused to attend any public gathering. They refused to sleep alone. They had nightmares. The program was discontinued in 1950. It was replaced by a more measured approach. The psychological research that followed the fire was groundbreaking. Dr. John Spiegel, a psychiatrist from Yale, studied the survivors. He interviewed 127 people. He found that the most common symptom was guilt. Survivors felt guilty for living. They felt guilty for not saving others. They felt guilty for enjoying the circus afterward. He called it survivor syndrome. The term was later renamed survivor's guilt. It became a recognized mental health condition. Dr. Spiegel also studied the behavior of the crowd. He found that people who had been given no instruction were more likely to survive. They acted on instinct. They ran. They climbed. They kicked. They tore the canvas. People who had been told to stay seated waited. They obeyed the authority of the ringmaster. They stayed until it was too late. He concluded that panic is not the opposite of order. Panic can be survival. The fire also influenced the design of public spaces. The requirement for exit signs, for panic bars on doors, for fire drills in schools and theaters, all were strengthened after 1945. But the lessons were not fully applied to temporary structures. Tents are still exempt from many building codes. A tent is considered a temporary structure. It does not require the same permits. It does not require the same inspections. The logic is that a tent can be taken down. The logic is that a tent is not a building. But a tent can kill as many people as a building. In 1970, a fire at a tent revival in Tennessee killed 15 people. The tent was treated with kerosene. The exits were tied. The fire was started by a candle. In 1976, a fire at a circus in France killed 30. The tent was not flame-proofed. In 1985, a fire at a circus in India killed 45. The tent was made of jute. The jute had been treated with oil. The pattern continued into the 21st century. In 2011, a fire at a traveling circus in Brazil killed 7 people. The tent was made of nylon. The nylon had not been treated. The exits were blocked by equipment. In 2013, a fire at a circus in Russia killed 4. The tent was made of polyester. The polyester had been treated with a flammable glue. The fire was caused by a cigarette. The Hartford Circus Fire is not a historical anomaly. It is part of a long history of tent fires. The difference is the scale. The difference is the number of children. The difference is the level of public outrage. The public outcry after Hartford led to a temporary change in public opinion. But the circus industry adapted. It rebranded, it diversified, it moved indoors, it presented itself as safe. The fire was mentioned only in passing. The word Hartford was not used. The fire was referred to as an incident in 1944. By the 1960s, the circus was back to full capacity. The tents were larger. The crowds were bigger. The fire code had been updated, but the enforcement was still weak. In 1965, a circus in Detroit was inspected. The inspector found that the tent exits were tied. He ordered the circus to untie them. The circus untied them for the inspection. They retied them after the inspector left. The inspector never returned. The Hartford fire also revealed a flaw in the legal system. The circus could not be held fully accountable. The company filed for bankruptcy. The assets were moved. The new company was not liable. The victims received settlements that were too small to cover their medical bills. Many survivors went into debt. Some lost their homes. Some were sent to state-run hospitals because they could not afford treatment. The city of Hartford also faced financial strain. The cost of the disaster was estimated at $1 million. The city had to pay for the morgue, the investigation, the counseling, the memorials. It was reimbursed by the circus, but only partially. The city cut services. It laid off employees. It raised taxes. The economic impact was felt for years, but the city also changed. The fire brought the community together. Neighbors helped neighbors. Strangers rescued strangers. The fire created a shared identity. People referred to themselves as Hartford survivors. They held reunions. They wrote books. They gave interviews. They kept the memory alive. Today, the Hartford Circus Fire is taught in schools. It is included in fire safety curricula. It is studied in history courses. It is referenced in discussions about crowd control. It is mentioned in debates about building codes, but the lessons have not been fully learned. In 2021, a fire at a wedding tent in Iraq killed 114 people. The tent was made of synthetic fabric. The exits were blocked. The fire was caused by a sparkler. The same pattern, the same causes, the same result. What does the Hartford Circus Fire teach us? It teaches us that systems fail. It teaches us that people make mistakes. It teaches us that safety is not automatic. It teaches us that the cost of neglect is measured in lives. The fire also teaches us about memory. The victims are remembered. Their names are read every year. Their stories are told. Their bodies are buried, but the question remains unanswered. The question that echoes is not how did this happen? The question is when will it happen again? The tent burned. The children died. The circus moved on. The laws changed. The laws were not enforced. The tent burned again, and still the exits remain tied. On the morning of July 6, 1944, at approximately 2:15 p.m., the fire had been burning for only 15 minutes. But in the city of Hartford, the investigation had already begun. The first fire department official arrived at the smoking remains of the Big Top at 2:22 p.m. He found bodies still inside the collapsed canvas. He found children still trapped under seats. He found firefighters still spraying water on the smoldering fabric. The investigation that followed would last for years. What happened in the hours after the fire? The police cordoned off the entire area. The crowd of survivors and onlookers grew to several thousand. The morgue was established at a nearby armory. The bodies were brought in on trucks, on wagons, on handcarts. The identification process began immediately, but the bodies were burnt beyond recognition. Many had no skin. Many had no faces. Teeth were used for identification. Dental records were requested from dentists across the city. The process took weeks. By 4 p.m., the fire marshals had arrived. They began their inspection of the tent site. They measured the distance between the exit flees. They counted the number of ropes that had been tied. They took samples of the tent canvas. They interviewed witnesses. They collected statements from the circus employees. They asked the ringmaster why he had told the crowd to stay seated. The ringmaster said he had been following standard procedure. He had been trained to prevent panic. He had not known the fire was so fast. The investigation soon focused on the canvas. The tent had been treated with a mixture of paraffin wax and gasoline. The mixture was intended to waterproof the fabric, but it was also highly flammable. The fire marshals tested a piece of the canvas in a controlled environment. It ignited in less than 2 seconds. It burned at a temperature of over 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The canvas had become a wick. The tent had become a match. The circus company admitted that the waterproofing had been applied in 1940. The tent had been stored for 2 years. The treatment had hardened into a thick crust. The crust had cracked. The cracks allowed oxygen to reach the cloth. The fire spread through the cracks as if through fuse wire. But the investigation also found that the treatment had been routine. The company had used the same formula for decades. Other circuses had used similar mixtures. The difference was the condition of the tent. The tent was old. The treatment had aged. The tent had not been tested for flammability because no testing standard existed. The question became who had applied the treatment. The circus had a maintenance crew. The crew had no training in chemistry. They had no knowledge of fire safety. The treatment was applied in the same way as painting a fence. The mixture was brushed onto the fabric. The application was uneven. Some sections received 3 coats. Other sections received 1. The fire spread fastest where the treatment was thickest. The investigation also examined the exits. The flaps had been tied shut with ropes. The knots were examined. They were simple square knots. They could be untied quickly. But the crowd had not tried to untie them. The crowd had pushed against the flaps. The force of the push had tightened the knots. The knots became impossible to undo. The fire marshals tested this theory. They tied a flap shut and asked a group of people to push against it. The knots held. The only way to open the flap was for someone to reach the knot from inside the crowd. That was impossible. The circus company argued that the flaps had been untied before the show. The employees claimed they had conducted a check. The check had been done 30 minutes before the fire, but the check had not been witnessed. No log was kept. The only proof was the word of the employees, and the employees were facing lawsuits. The legal aftermath was complex. The circus company filed for bankruptcy protection in August 1944. The filing halted all pending claims. The victims could not sue. The company then transferred its assets to a new entity. The new entity was not responsible for the old debt. The victims were left with nothing. The city of Hartford filed a lawsuit against the circus company for negligence. The trial began in 1945. The jury heard testimony from eyewitnesses, from fire marshals, from chemists, from circus executives. The circus argued that the fire was an act of God. The judge rejected that argument. The jury found the circus liable for gross negligence. The city was awarded $200,000 in damages, but the circus company had no assets. The judgment was never paid. The victims then turned to the state government. They demanded legislation that would prevent such a disaster from happening again. The Connecticut legislature responded by passing a bill in 1945 that required all tent structures to have at least 6 clearly marked exits. The exits had to be unlocked during performances. The law also required that tent fabric be treated with fire retardant, but the law had no enforcement mechanism. The state did not hire inspectors. The tents were not inspected unless someone filed a complaint, and no one filed complaints. In 1946, the National Fire Protection Association published a new standard for tent structures. The standard included specific requirements for exit width, exit marking, and fabric flammability. The NFPA code became the model for state legislation, but adoption was slow. By 1948, only 15 states had adopted the code. The rest had not. What happened to the survivors? The physical injuries were extensive. Over 400 people had been treated at hospitals. Many had degree burns. Many had broken bones from jumping off the bleachers. Many had lung damage from inhaling smoke. The recovery took months. Some survivors needed reconstructive surgery. Some lost the use of their hands. Some were permanently disfigured. The psychological injuries were less visible but more lasting. The Yale study continued for 5 years. The researchers found that many survivors had developed phobias of tents, of crowds, of fire, of entertainment. Some refused to go to any public event. Some refused to enter any building that did not have visible exits. Some had panic attacks at the sound of a siren. The phobias were treated with therapy, but the therapy was not widely available. The treatment was experimental. One survivor, a 12-year-old girl, was quoted saying she smelled the fire every night. The smell returned when she was stressed. The smell returned when she was upset. The smell returned in her dreams. The smell was caused by her brain linking the smoke with trauma. The smell was not real, but it was as real as memory. The study also identified a phenomenon called death guilt. Survivors who had escaped while others died felt that they had done something wrong. They felt that they should have stayed to help. They felt that they did not deserve to live. The guilt was irrational, but it was overwhelming. Some survivors spent years trying to justify why they survived. Some blamed themselves for the death of a sibling. The Hartford Fire also reshaped the way children were treated after disasters. Before 1944, children were rarely included in post-disaster counseling. They were expected to be resilient. They were expected to get over it. But the Yale study showed that children were not resilient. They were vulnerable. They needed intervention. The study led to the development of child-focused trauma therapy. The therapy was first used in 1948. It became standard practice by the 1950s. The circus itself changed. The Ringling Brothers Circus moved entirely indoors by 1956. The tent was retired. The big top was replaced by arenas and stadiums. The circus used permanent structures with fire suppression systems. The risk of tent fires was eliminated for the largest circus. But smaller circuses continued to use tents. They could not afford the cost of arenas. They continued to operate with the same risks. The Hartford Fire became a cautionary tale. It was taught in fire science programs. It was cited in court cases. It was referenced in safety regulations. But the memory faded with time. By the 1960s, the fire was no longer a topic of public conversation. The survivors grew older. The children who had been burned grew into adults. They carried their scars in silence. On July 6, 1994, a memorial service was held at the site of the fire. A plaque was unveiled. The plaque listed the names of the 168 victims. The families of the survivors attended. Some had never spoken about the fire until that day. The service was covered by the local news. The national news did not attend. The question that remains is what can be learned from the Hartford Circus Fire. The technical lessons are clear. Tents must be fire retardant. Exits must be open. Crowd management must be practiced. But the deeper lesson is about accountability. The circus company was not held fully accountable. The laws were not enforced. The system failed not because of a single moment of negligence, but because of a chain of small failures. Each failure seemed small by itself. Each failure seemed acceptable at the time. But together, they created a death trap. The fire also reminds us that safety is not automatic. It requires constant monitoring. It requires independent inspection. It requires a culture that prioritizes prevention over profit. The Hartford Fire was not a freak accident. It was the product of a system that valued spectacle over safety. In 2019, a circus in Germany used a tent that had been treated with flame retardant. The tent was inspected. The exits were clear. The fire drill was conducted. The show was safe, but the operator said it was only because of Hartford. The memory of the fire had traveled across generations and across oceans. The fire had become a reference point. The fire had become a reason to care. And still, the risk remains. There are tents around the world that are not treated. There are exits that are not marked. There are crowds that are not prepared. The lessons are not always applied. The fire does not always echo. But when the next tent fire occurs, the investigation will start the same way. The fire marshals will arrive. The canvas will be tested. The exits will be examined. And the question will be asked again: how could this happen? The answer will be the same as it was in Hartford. The answer will be that someone decided that safety was an option, and someone paid the price. The identification of the victims took weeks. Of the 168 people who died, 163 were identified by family members, dental records, or personal effects. 5 remained unknown. The most famous of these was a young girl, approximately 6 years old, with light brown hair and blue eyes. She had died in the fire, but no one came forward to claim her. The authorities placed her photograph in newspapers across the country. The photograph showed a child with severe burns, but her face was still recognizable. No one recognized her. The child was buried in a marked grave in Hartford's Northwood Cemetery. The grave was labeled with a small stone that read "Unknown Child, 19 Furfur." The case of the unknown girl became a mystery. For decades, amateur sleuths and genealogists attempted to identify her. They searched birth records, missing persons reports, and family histories. They found nothing. In 1991, the body was exhumed for DNA testing. The testing was inconclusive. The technology was not yet advanced enough. The child remained unknown. In 2018, a new effort was launched. The DNA was reanalyzed using modern techniques. The results were matched to a family in Vermont. The child was identified as Eleanor Cook, a 6-year-old girl who had been visiting Hartford with her family. Her mother and brother had also died in the fire. Her father had survived. The father had never been able to identify his daughter's body because the burns had changed her appearance. He had searched for her, but he had given up after months. He died in 1979, never knowing what happened to her. The identification brought closure to distant relatives, but it also raised questions. How could a child disappear in a public disaster and not be identified for 74 years? The answer was that the system for identifying disaster victims in 1944 was primitive. Dental records were used, but they were not standardized. Fingerprints were taken, but children did not have fingerprint cards. DNA did not exist. Identification relied on memory and paperwork, and memory is fallible. The case of Eleanor Cook became a catalyst for improving disaster victim identification protocols. The International Criminal Police Organization began developing guidelines for large-scale identification efforts. The guidelines included the use of multiple identifiers, centralized databases, and rapid DNA analysis. The guidelines were tested in subsequent disasters, such as the attacks of September 11, 2001, and the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami. The protocols worked, but they were born from a child who was forgotten. The fire also changed the way burn victims were treated. In 1944, the standard treatment for severe burns was tannic acid. The acid was sprayed onto the burns to form a protective layer. The theory was that the layer would prevent infection and fluid loss, but the acid caused damage to underlying tissue. It also made it difficult to clean the wounds later. The Hartford doctors quickly abandoned tannic acid. They used saline baths and petroleum gauze instead. The new treatment reduced infection rates. It also reduced scarring. The approach was published in medical journals. It became the standard for burn care. By the 1950s, specialized burn units were established in major hospitals. The units used sterile environments, skin grafts, and antibiotics. The survival rate for severe burns improved from less than 20% to more than 50%. The Hartford Fire had inadvertently advanced medicine. The psychological impact was studied in depth. The Yale researchers followed the survivors for 5 years. They published their findings in 1949. The study was called the Hartford Fire, a study in panic behavior. It was the first major study of crowd behavior during a disaster. The researchers found that panic was not random. It followed patterns. People toward the center of the crowd took longer to react. They were shielded from the immediate threat. People near the edges reacted faster. Women were more likely to attempt escape before men. Children were often carried or pushed by adults. The study concluded that panic could be predicted and managed. The key was to provide clear instructions, maintain visibility, and prevent bottlenecks. The findings were used to design evacuation plans for theaters, stadiums, and schools. The findings were also used to train police and fire departments. The Hartford Fire became a textbook case in emergency management, but the textbook cases often omitted the human cost. The survivors who could not speak about the fire did not appear in the studies. They were hidden. One survivor, a man in his 30s, refused to attend any event that involved a tent. He would drive miles out of his way to avoid a circus poster. He could not explain why to his children. He just said he did not like circuses. Another survivor, a woman who had been 9 years old in 1944, never entered a building with a single exit. She would check every door before sitting down in a restaurant. Her family thought she was paranoid. She did not tell them about the fire until she was 60 years old. The silence was a survival mechanism, but it also isolated them. The city of Hartford did not forget the fire, but it moved on. The site of the circus grounds was redeveloped. A shopping center was built. A street was renamed Circus Way. A small park was created. The park contained a memorial with the names of the victims. The memorial was dedicated in 1994, 50 years after the fire. The ceremony was attended by survivors, family members, and city officials. The mayor spoke about the lessons learned. The fire chief spoke about the changes in safety. The survivors spoke about their memories. One survivor, a woman who had been burned on her arms and legs, said she still could not stand the smell of canvas. She had never been to a circus since. She had not even taken her grandchildren. She said the fire had stolen that from her. The crowd applauded her courage. Then they went home. The legal aftermath continued for decades. The circus company had filed for bankruptcy and won 9-4. The move was legal, but it was controversial. The company had insurance. The insurance was used to pay legal fees, not victims. The victims received nothing. In 1946, a group of victims' families sued the insurance company directly. The lawsuit alleged that the insurance company had conspired with the circus to hide assets. The court dismissed the case. The families appealed. The appeals lasted until 1950. The court ruled in favor of the insurance company. The families received nothing. In 1949, the state of Connecticut passed the Fire Safety Code. The code required all places of public assembly to have a minimum number of exits, emergency lighting, and fire extinguishers. The code also required that all interior finishes be fire retardant. The code was enforced by the state fire marshal. The circus tents were no longer exempt, but the code did not apply retroactively. Tents built before 1949 could continue without upgrades. The loophole allowed older tents to operate without fireproofing. It was not until 1972 that the code was updated to require all tents to meet the same standards. By then, the circus industry had changed. The big top was no longer common. The circuses that remained used permanent structures. The risk was lower. The Hartford Fire also influenced the development of the National Fire Protection Association's Life Safety Code. The code was first published in 1927, but it was updated after major disasters. The Hartford Fire led to specific provisions for tents. The provisions required that tent exits be at least 6 feet wide. They required that the exits be marked with signs and lights. They required that the tent fabric be tested for flammability. The code became the basis for state laws across the country. By 1960, every state had adopted some version of the Life Safety Code. The adoption was not uniform. Some states enforced the code strictly. Others did not. The enforcement depended on local budgets and local priorities. In 1984, a circus tent fire in New York killed 5 people. The tent had not been fireproofed. The exits were blocked. The operator was charged with manslaughter. The trial revealed that the operator had known about the Hartford fire. He had ignored the lessons. He was convicted. He served 6 years in prison. The case was reported in the news, but it did not capture the public's attention. The Hartford fire had faded from memory. The new generation did not know the story. In 2012, a circus tent in Rhode Island collapsed during a performance. No one died, but several people were injured. The tent had not been inspected. The operator was fined. The local fire marshal said he did not have time to inspect every tent. He said there were too many events. He said the system relied on self-policing, the same system that had failed in Hartford. The question that continues to surface is whether the Hartford fire could happen again. The technical answer is no. The materials used in modern tents are more fire-resistant. The exit requirements are stricter. The inspections are more frequent, but the human factors have not changed. Crowds still panic. Operators still cut corners. Budgets still limit enforcement. The fire that started in 1944 is not just a historical event. It is a template. It is a demonstration of how systems can fail when no one is watching. The number 168 remains on the plaque. The number does not include the injured. It does not include the families who lost loved ones. It does not include the survivors who carried the trauma for the rest of their lives. The number is a placeholder. The full impact of the Hartford Circus Fire cannot be counted. It can only be felt, and it is still being felt. In 2024, the 80th anniversary of the fire was observed. A small ceremony was held at the memorial. A handful of survivors attended. They were in their 80s and 90s. They spoke about the fire as if it had happened yesterday. They described the smell, the heat, the screams. They described running. They described being lifted by strangers. They described waking up in a hospital bed with no memory of how they got there. One survivor, a man who had been 5 years old at the time, said he still had nightmares. He said the nightmares were the same every time. He was in the tent. The fire started. He could not find his mother. He could not find the exit. He woke up sweating. He said he had learned to live with it, but he had never learned to forget. The fire ends with those words. But the story does not end. It continues in every tent that is properly inspected. It continues in every fire drill that is conducted. It continues in every exit that is kept clear. The Hartford fire is not a story about the past. It is a story about what can happen when people decide that safety is optional. It is a story that is still being written, and it is a story that is still being ignored. At 2:40 p.m. on the 6th of July, 1944, a train pulled into the Hartford station. It carried the Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey Circus coming from New Haven. The unloading took hours. Elephants were led down ramps. Cage wagons were rolled off flat cars. Performers carried trunks of costumes into waiting trucks. The advance team had already set up the tent on Barber Street. The layout was the same as always. The big top faced south. The menagerie tent was to the east. The midway ran between them. The crew had performed the same setup hundreds of times. They worked quickly. The afternoon performance was scheduled for 4:30. The evening performance would follow at 8. The sun was high. The sky was clear. Nothing suggested what was coming. At 3:15 p.m., the ticket booth opened. The line formed early. Families walked from the surrounding neighborhoods. Children held balloons. Parents carried blankets. The circus had been advertised for weeks. Posters showed clowns and acrobats. The promise of escape from wartime worries drew crowds. By 4 p.m., the big top was nearly full. The capacity was listed at 9,000. The actual number was closer to 7,000. The seats were wooden benches arranged in 3 sections. The center section faced the main entrance. The 2 side sections were flanked by the exits. The exits were canvas flaps at the bottom of the tent walls. They were not marked. They were not illuminated. They were not kept clear. The tent itself was a canvas shell held up by 6 center poles and a ring of quarter poles. The fabric had been treated with paraffin wax to waterproof it. The paraffin was flammable. The treatment had been applied in 1940. It had not been rechecked. At 4:25 p.m., the band started playing. The performers entered. The ringmaster introduced the acts, the audience clapped, the children cheered, the elephants performed, the trapeze artists swung, the clowns ran through the aisles. The show was typical, the audience was engaged, the temperature inside the tent was rising. The July heat was trapped under the canvas. The ventilation flaps were open, but they did little. The crowd stayed. At 4:30 p.m. something happened. The exact trigger was never determined. The investigators considered several possibilities: a discarded cigarette, a spark from a generator, a short circuit in an electrical cable. The circus had been warned about electrical safety. The generator was placed too close to the tent. The cables ran under the bleachers. The witnesses described a small flame near the menagerie exit. It climbed the wall. The canvas caught fire. The flame spread along the paraffin coating. Within seconds, the entire side of the tent was burning. The band stopped playing. The performers froze. The audience started to scream. At 4:31 p.m., the fire reached the roof of the tent. The canvas above the center poles ignited. The flames dropped burning pieces of fabric onto the crowd. The heat was intense. The smoke was thick. The exits were blocked by the flames. The main entrance was still open, but it was narrow. The people in the center section tried to push toward it. The people in the side sections tried to find the side exits. They could not see them. The exits were covered by the fire. The canvas flaps were burning. At 4:32 p.m., the stampede began. The crowd moved as a single mass. People were knocked down. People were trampled. The pile of bodies grew at the main entrance. The weight of the crowd pressed against the people in front. They could not move. They could not breathe. The pressure was crushing. Some people tried to climb over the pile. They fell into it. Others tried to cut through the canvas walls. They used pocket knives. They used their hands. The canvas was strong. It resisted. The flames reached them before they could escape. At 4:33 p.m., the fire department received the first call. The operator recorded the address. The engines were dispatched. The travel time was 3 minutes. The fire trucks arrived at 4:36 p.m. The tent was already collapsed. The fire was still burning. The firefighters used axes to cut through the canvas. They used hoses to suppress the flames. They found the bodies. They found the survivors. They carried them out. The scene was chaotic. The survivors were screaming. The dead were everywhere. The firefighters worked until the fire was out. They worked until the last body was recovered. At 6 p.m., the casualty count began. The injured were taken to Hartford Hospital, St. Francis Hospital, and other nearby facilities. The dead were taken to a temporary morgue set up at the circus grounds. The identification process was slow. Many of the victims were children. They had no identification. They were separated from their parents. Some parents were dead. Some children were dead. The bodies were tagged with numbers. The numbers were matched to descriptions. The descriptions were posted at the morgue entrance. Families waited in line. They looked at the bodies. They identified their children. They identified their spouses. They identified their parents. What happened was not a single failure. It was a cascade. The tent was not fireproof. The exits were insufficient. The exits were unmarked. The crowd was dense. The panic was overwhelming. But beneath those obvious failures was a deeper problem. The problem was that no one had been responsible for safety. The circus company had a safety manager. He was not present on the day of the fire. He had been assigned to another task. The city had a fire marshal. He had inspected the tent the day before. He had noted the exits. He had noted the electrical cables. He had not issued a citation. He had not required changes. The inspection was considered routine. The violations were considered minor. The circus had operated in Hartford for decades. The assumption was that nothing would happen. That assumption was wrong. The legal investigation began immediately. The Hartford police interviewed witnesses. The state fire marshal examined the scene. The circus company cooperated. The circus company also took precautions. They destroyed the damaged tent. They disposed of the evidence. The investigators objected. The circus claimed the tent was a safety hazard. They said they were removing it to prevent further accidents. The investigators suspected otherwise. They suspected the circus was trying to conceal the cause of the fire. The destruction of the tent made it impossible to determine the exact origin. The investigation was hampered. The conclusion was inconclusive. In 1945, the circus company was charged with manslaughter. The charges were based on the failure to provide adequate exits. The trial lasted 2 months. The prosecution presented witnesses. The defense argued that the fire was an accident. The defense argued that the circus had complied with all applicable regulations. The regulations at the time were vague. The tent was not subject to the same standards as a permanent building. The prosecution could not prove criminal intent. The jury acquitted the company. The verdict was controversial. The public was outraged, but the legal system had done its work. The circus was free to operate. The company did not operate for long. The financial cost of the fire was too high. The lawsuits were too many. The company filed for bankruptcy in 1945. The assets were sold. The circus disbanded. The performers scattered. The animals were sent to other circuses. The name Ringling Brothers continued under new ownership. The new owners promised to prioritize safety. They did, but the old company was gone. The old leadership was gone. The accountability was gone. The state of Connecticut conducted its own investigation. The report was published in 1945. It was 400 pages. It included photographs, diagrams, and testimony. The report recommended new regulations for tents and temporary structures. The recommendations were ignored. The state legislature was preoccupied with other matters. The war was ending. The economy was shifting. The fire was a local tragedy. The legislature did not act until 1949. In 1947, a fire at a nightclub in Boston killed 492 people. The Coconut Grove fire was similar to Hartford. The exits were blocked. The interior finishes were flammable. The panic was overwhelming. The investigation revealed the same patterns. The response was different. The city of Boston implemented new fire codes immediately. The state of Massachusetts followed. The national conversation shifted. The Hartford fire was cited as a precursor. The lessons were finally being learned. In 1948, the National Fire Protection Association published a report on the Hartford fire. The report was used by fire departments across the country. The report included a detailed analysis of the crowd behavior. The report concluded that the primary cause of death was asphyxiation. The smoke and heat killed people before the flames reached them. The report also noted that the exits were too small. The total exit width was less than half of what was needed for the crowd size. The report recommended that all places of public assembly have at least one exit for every 500 people. The recommendation became a standard. The survivors had to live with the aftermath. Some of them dedicated their lives to fire safety. A young man named John, who had escaped through a cut in the canvas, became a fire inspector. He worked for the city of Hartford. He inspected every tent that came to town. He carried a measuring tape. He measured the exit widths. He checked the fireproofing. He issued citations. He was known as the circus cop. He worked until his retirement in 1985. He said he never went to a circus. He said he did not need to see one. A woman named Margaret, who had lost her daughter in the fire, became a lobbyist for fire safety legislation. She testified before the state legislature. She spoke at public hearings. She wrote letters to newspapers. She was quoted in the Hartford Courant. She said the fire was not an accident. She said it was a crime. She died in 1968. The laws she helped pass are still on the books. The children who survived grew up. They became parents. They became grandparents. They told their stories to their families. Some of the stories were passed down for generations. A man named David, whose mother had survived the fire, said his mother never talked about it. He learned about it from his grandmother. His grandmother said his mother was carrying her little brother. She was running. She fell. She dropped the brother. She picked him up. She kept running. They both survived. His mother never mentioned it. He was 40 years old when he first saw the memorial. He stood in front of the plaque. He counted the names. He said it felt real for the first time. The memorial itself is a simple structure. It is a granite obelisk with the names of the victims. The names are listed alphabetically. There is no distinction between adults and children. There is no mention of the cause. The inscription reads in memory of those who lost their lives in the Hartford Circus Fire, July 6, 1944. The names are carved deep. The letters are filled with black paint. The paint has faded. The names are still legible. The park around the memorial is quiet. The grass is mowed. The benches are shaded by trees. The children who play there do not know what happened. Their parents do not tell them. The fire is not part of the local curriculum. It is not taught in schools. It is not mentioned in history books outside of Connecticut. The memory is fading, but the story is still being told. It is being told by the survivors, who are fewer every year. It is being told by the families who inherited the trauma. It is being told by the historians who study the disaster. It is being told by the firefighters who train for crowd emergencies. The story is not about a circus. It is about the cost of neglect. It is about the fragility of safety. It is about the moments when systems fail and ordinary people are left to face the consequences. The Hartford Circus Fire is not a story that belongs to the past. It is a story that belongs to the present. Every time a concert hall is filled beyond capacity, the lessons of Hartford are tested. Every time a fire exit is blocked, the risk is repeated. Every time a safety regulation is ignored, the potential for disaster grows. The fire was not inevitable. It was the result of small decisions made over months and years. The circus company chose to save money. The city chose to look the other way. The public chose to trust. Those choices had consequences. They still do. At 8 o'clock in the morning on July 7, 1944, the makeshift morgue at the Hartford Armory was overwhelmed. The bodies had been brought in throughout the night. They were laid out in rows on the armory floor. Firefighters, police officers, and volunteers worked by flashlight. The electricity in the surrounding neighborhood was still unstable. The heat from the fire had melted wiring and blown transformers. The armory had its own generator, but it was old. It flickered. The workers did not stop. The identification process was slow. Many of the victims were burned beyond recognition. Their faces were gone. Their clothing was fused to their skin. Their fingers were curled into claws from the heat. Fingerprinting was possible only for a few. Dental records were used for others. The families of missing persons were brought to the armory. They were asked to look at jewelry. They were asked to look at shoes. They were asked to look at the small objects recovered from the bodies. Watches, rings, hairpins, a doll that a child had been holding. The doll was identified by a mother. She said her daughter never let go of it. The doll was the only way she could claim the body. The medical examiners worked for days. They classified the victims by age and sex. They made diagrams of the burn patterns. They tried to determine the cause of death for each one. The official cause for most was asphyxiation. The smoke had filled their lungs. The carbon monoxide had replaced the oxygen. They died before the flames reached them. Some had died from crushing. The crowd had compressed them. Their ribs were broken. Their organs were ruptured. Others had died from thermal injuries. They had been trapped near the entrance. The flames had consumed them in seconds. The children were the hardest to identify. Their teeth were not fully developed. Their fingerprints were not on file. Their faces were too damaged. Some families had to wait days. Some families had to wait weeks. 8 bodies were never identified. They were buried in a common grave at the Zion Hill Cemetery. The grave was marked with a single stone. It read, "Unknown victims of Hartford Circus Fire." The stone is still there. The names are not known. The circus company had already begun to dismantle. On July 8th, the tent was cut down. Poles were removed. The canvas was rolled up. The ropes were coiled. The trucks were loaded. The circus left Hartford. They went to their winter quarters in Sarasota, Florida. The company issued a statement. They expressed regret. They promised to cooperate. They also started shredding documents. They burned correspondence. They destroyed photographs. They removed the names of performers from the seating charts. The investigators arrived in Sarasota 2 weeks later. The circus offices were nearly empty. The files were gone. The state of Connecticut issued subpoenas. The circus company refused to comply. The legal battle went to the Connecticut Supreme Court. The court ruled in favor of the state. The circus was ordered to produce all records. The circus lawyer argued that the records were destroyed in a routine cleanup. The judge did not believe them, but there was no evidence of intentional destruction. The case was weakened. In 1945, the trial began. The circus company was charged with 10 counts of manslaughter. The prosecution argued that the company knew the tent was not fireproofed. They argued that the exits were too few. They argued that the company chose profit over safety. The defense argued that the fire was an accident. They argued that the tent was inspected. They argued that the circus followed industry standards. The industry standards were low. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. They returned a verdict of not guilty. The families of the victims were devastated. One mother stood outside the courthouse. She held a photograph of her son. She said the law failed. She said the system failed. She said her son was dead and the circus was free. She was not wrong. The circus company filed for bankruptcy. The assets were liquidated. The families filed civil lawsuits. The settlements were small. The insurance companies paid out less than $500,000. The families received an average of $3,000 each. That was enough for a funeral. It was not enough for justice. The fire did lead to changes. The National Fire Protection Association updated its standards for tents in 1945. The new standards required fireproofing, adequate exits, and fire extinguishers at every entrance. The standards were voluntary. The states had to adopt them into law. Connecticut did not adopt them until 1949. By then, the memory of the fire had faded. The politicians had moved on, but the fire department in Hartford never forgot. The fire chief ordered every fire station to keep a copy of the investigation report. He used the report in training. He required his firefighters to study the crowd behavior. He required them to practice evacuation drills. He said the lesson of Hartford was that panic is predictable. He said the lesson was that exits matter. He said the lesson was that every second counts. The report itself is still used by fire investigators. It is cited in textbooks. It is referenced in court cases. It is a case study in crowd dynamics and fire suppression. The fire was a tragedy. It was also a data point. The data has saved lives. It has prevented other fires. It has changed the way we design public spaces. The Hartford Circus Fire is not forgotten. It is remembered in the granite of the memorial. It is remembered in the pages of the report. It is remembered in the lessons passed from one generation of firefighters to the next. The people who died are gone. Their names are carved in stone. Their story is carved into the law. That is the only justice they ever got.